Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome to another episode of Comic Book Workshop. Today we are looking at Todd McFarlane. And so this kind of completes what I had mentioned before back in the Jim Lee episode that I was going to be covering a couple of different artists that were, all around at the same time with Jim Lee, Greg Capullo, and Todd McFarlane. And I mean, obviously these guys are still around, but I'm talking about back in the heyday of the 90s, right? And Yeah, so we're going to flip through. We're going to look at some pages from Todd McFarlane and talk about some of the things it is that we see and see what we can learn so that we can take that information and apply it to our own work. And now Todd McFarlane is, he's most primarily known as the writer of Spawn now. I'm not sure if he's illustrating any books anymore or how long he's been illustrating or how long he hasn't been illustrating. But it's interesting to look at these three artists and to kind of compare and contrast. For example, we have this Spider-Man cover that at the time was very controversial. I believe this is a very famous cover that Todd did for the way it is that he depicted Spider-Man. Yeah, he depicted him as kind of having a little bit of an edge to him, and I think that this is kind of the beginning of whenever it is that we start to see his style start to emerge and this sort of thing started to carry over into the stuff that he would do with Spawn, and then probably a lot with the direction that he gave Greg Capullo for Spawn whenever he took over Spawn. But I think that this is a really cool cover. It's very iconic. I do think that the the lines it is that he's using here are very reminiscent of what we talked about with Greg Capullo and what we talked about with Jim Lee, where we have these leading lines that are kind of all pointing us to our focal point, which is very relevant when it comes to something like a cover, right? Like I've mentioned this before. Whenever you're doing some cover art, you want there to be one focal point and you want everything in that page to basically be pointing there to that. And that's using different elements of contrast and things along those lines in order to do that. So I think he does a really good job of that here. Todd McFarlane's style, it definitely evolved over the years, but it feels very much like a half step in between what Spawn would end up being and what a lot of the classic, like 70s, 80s comic artists like Eric Larson and those kinds of guys did, right? The proportions of Spider-Man here are pretty reasonable. They're not like completely out of control the way it is that some of the other comic stuff, specifically Spawn, would get later on. And again, we see these same sorts of things over and over again. I know I'm in fear of, you know, kind of repeating myself, or at risk of repeating myself, but there's always these leading lines that are pointing us and keeping our eye exactly where it is that he wants us to look. And this is something it is that we see with all the comic artists is that they have a very strong understanding of how to group things into a completely dark black shadow and then allowing that to basically be the contrasting element for whenever it is that they want to put things into actual detail. I think that Todd McFarlane, maybe if he looked back at some of these images, he might change some of the way it is that he draws some of this stuff. That's not to say that I'm criticizing the image because I think this is a really beautifully illustrated image and is definitely better than I can do. However, there's a couple of things it is that grab my attention, specifically the detail here in the background. I wonder if it would have looked better if some of the smoke detail was kind of left out. And it would have helped maybe create a little bit of an element of contrast because I think some of the detail here on Spider-Man can kind of get lost a little bit, at least to me. That's what it is that it looks like. I really enjoy his style. I think his style is like it's super fun, and even though Greg Capullo really became the artist of Spawn, I think that Todd McFarlane with the way it is that he drew Spider-Man. Obviously it set the tone for all the stuff it is that he would be involved with going further on. This is a really nice piece. I love this. I love the way it is that, we've talked about this before, and I've mentioned a YouTube channel called Force Drawing here on YouTube. And this is something would be really useful to understand. If you look up the Force Drawing YouTube channel, I'll try to remember and add it to the description. But there's a lot of curves that are going on here, and then there's elements of like these black shapes that are kind of keeping your eye from going completely off the page, right? And this element of curve and the way that he's able to do this, like say for example with this body here, you have basically this shape that kind of goes like this, if I was to draw through it, right? And so you have this big curve on one side, and then you have kind of like this exact opposite on the other side, right? And this is something it is that he talks about in his force videos. Maybe I'll make a video specifically on that. Um, but you can see that it gives it the sense of gesture, the sense of motion, the sense of something moving through the air. That it can be very difficult, specifically with the beginner artist. Like when you go and you do life drawing, um, the beginning artist will try to do life drawing, and it'll always look really stiff. And I remember personally, whenever I started to learn how to draw shapes that have a sense of motion, that was a big deal to me. Because you can copy the anatomy of an arm, you can copy the anatomy of a body as much as it is that you want. But if it looks flat and it looks like nothing is actually happening, there's nothing that's like kinetic going on within the illustration, then it's just a boring illustration. And it just shows you that it has so much to do with an understanding of the creative decisions it is that the artists are making, and not necessarily just the amount of hours it is that you put on the page. Yes, the amount of time it is that you put into drawing something is obviously very important. The amount of effort you put into it. Um, but you also have to have the understanding. You have to have an understanding of what it is what kind of creative decisions these guys are making. I think it's really cool too. And that's the thing I love about McFarlane's drawings here is there's so much like kinetic energy. Like it's almost got this kind of like I don't know, like an AD&D, AD&D, ADHD kind of vibe to it. Like there's so much going on. Like you have this chain, and this chain is leading to the hand. And then again, you have this curve here as he's slamming into this wall. But then we have these speed lines, right? And then these speed lines are leading us into this completely different type of line here, right? So you could really go through Todd McFarlane's work, and you could break it down in so many different ways and see the way it is that he's using different types of inking techniques in order to create in order to create different types of textures, right? The shading on the motorcycle here, the front of this motorcycle, is different than the shading the on the jacket of Ghost Rider, right? We have this kind of like this curvy kind of white shapes, curvy white shapes on the motorcycle. Whereas it's much more pointed, right? And there's much more of them. And so he does a really good job of, and then of course, like I said, you have these fire lines. These fire lines are totally different than the action lines that are going on back here, right? So he can really give you a idea of different ways it is that you can draw different parts of the image. So the level of detail is just it's really crazy, and I love the fact that Spider-Man. There's so much going on in the suit of Spider-Man, but the detail of the costume is really helping give you an idea of how the form is churning in space, right? It's really cool. So I think this is okay. This is a 1992 McFarlane image. I assume that he's also inking this stuff, you know? I'm not 100% sure, but again, it's the same thing. It's like we have this really strong kinetic energy in the piece, and there's a strong sense of motion. And so if that's something it is that you want to illustrate, then you want to be able to really break these forms down and see the way it is that they're working. And force drawing is a really good way to do that. Like I said, I'll have to make some tutorials on that specifically. I know I don't do a lot of specific tutorials, but I think that'll probably change in the next couple of months or so, right? What's really interesting as well is the way it is that he's kind of created these very subtle borders around everything, right? Like we have this obvious border that goes like this all the way around the image. But what I just noticed is he also does the same thing with the nunchucks, right? You have this that goes down like this, and then this is going up like this, right? And so there's this kind of like he's kind of drawing, and then you have also this, the bandana, and so he's kind of drawing another border around where it is that he wants you to look, which is here, right? So he almost has two borders in one, which is really cool. It's really smart. It's really interesting to go back and look at a lot of artists' older work. I mean, I would be interested in knowing like what his opinion is on some of his older work. I think as all artists, we always look back at our older work and we don't always think the highest of it. And this is such a strange looking Wolverine to me. Um, it's interesting. I mean, like it's definitely a Wolverine piece, but you can also begin to see the beginnings of the way it is that this style would carry over into what he would do with Spawn, right? Like there's almost an obsessive amount of detail and obsessive amount of things going on. It's like we have the fire of the cigarette is creating this plume of smoke that's cutting across the face, and it's kind of doing this diagonal thing, right? Like it's going this way and then it's going over here, 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 all over the image. And then we have, he's just like slobbering all over himself here out of his mouth, which to me is just kind of funny. Um, I imagine it would have been cooler if he was if he had got busted in the eye and it was like blood dripping down his face or something. And then obviously we have this brown color, this brown ink, and all of the forms are kind of doing what? They're all kind of pointing us in one direction, which is where it is that he wants us to look towards the face. There's something about the face that just looks so weird to me, though. Yeah, I mean, like he has a lot of kinetic energy in his pieces, and I think that's why it is that people love his work so much. Is that it's not these boring images of Spider-Man just standing on a rooftop overlooking a city, right? There's a lot of webbing and it's all over the place, right? Another really, really cool classic image. I love the way that he positions the hands, the way that he positions the goblin behind Spider-Man. This was like an old wizard cover. I think he did. I think he did this like I'm guessing this was back before he did Spawn. You know. Um, but it's interesting to see how his style, obviously it became something that it evolved into something where he put a lot more detail into things. But the kinetic energy is still there. Yeah, this is another Wolverine shot. It's really cool. Um, there's a lot of different things that go on in a page like this that I think is easy to overlook, right? If we go back and we look at the Jim Lee video or the Greg Capullo videos that I did in the last couple of weeks, I mentioned how the different ways that they crosshatch. And I think Todd McFarlane has a very unique way of crosshatching because his lines are very big in this image, right? We have these big lines that are going across, big lines. And then they become separated more and more as the form comes closer to us, right? Because the form of the leg is coming outwards, right? So as it gets closer to his crotch region, everything starts to form back into black shapes. But as it goes away and as it turns towards the leg, we see the same lines are spaced just as evenly, but then he brings in a cross hatching in order to connect to these darker shadow shapes here, right? And again, we have the same sort of sense of like a kinetic energy, right? His pose, it feels very much like he's able to move. You know what I mean? He feels like he's very much able to uh, move in the scene. But then we see this kind of the same sort of kinetic energy in the hair, how the hair lifts up and swirls around, right? Lots of different types of detail too. And so, like I was saying before, you can look at an artist like this and you can kind of get an idea, like even if you're doing a comic and you're not sure how to ink trees, for example, or how to do water, how do you want to ink this stuff? Um, looking at something like this and kind of having it to the side as you're illustrating something is pretty helpful. It's pretty useful because you can see how many different types of textures he was able to create with the ink. Another one of the things that he did that he became really iconic for was, breaking out of the panel the way it is that he does. And, I think this is probably a much later image of that was very probably at a later stage of his run on Spider-Man. And I say that because there's so much going on here, and you can tell that he's really experimented with what it is that the way he wants to draw Spider-Man. He basically has him upside down with his legs almost over his head, kicking outwards with a crazy amount of the webbing just shooting out everywhere, right? Even to where it is that it leaves the panel. And I think that helps sell it a as something that feels much larger than life, right? And this is obviously something that everybody does now, where you have things that are going off the page, and you have different elements, like even these birds that are coming out of the panel. But he still leaves room for the text. And then I guess this is like a much older piece. It's really interesting to see the way that he draws the anatomy. But I mean, from my perspective, when I look at a piece like this, what's interesting to me is that again, it goes back to what we were saying before in the previous videos, is that there's always this play of contrast. And I would ask you, how is the play of contrast going on here? I would say that it actually isn't really working that well as much as these other images, right? So I would say this is an image that this image here works very well, right? Because there's space in between where it is that he puts the detail. It's not, the detail isn't everywhere. It's like if you put detail everywhere, then the detail is nowhere in a sense. You know what I mean? Like you have to have elements of contrast. And when we look at an image like this, there's such a manic level of detail with really not a lot of white space in here or and not even a lot of black space, not even as much black space. Like you could imagine that instead of these action lines back here, he could have dropped a lot of this into black. But it does look like the figure got his head blown off, so maybe he was trying to create some space around here to keep that from being lost in the detail. So it definitely seems like this was a challenging page for sure. It is beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. But I think there's an element of contrast that's lost that he was able to nail with something like this. Like this feels like somebody who has matured quite a great deal, whereas this piece feels like he's still figuring things out, right? So that's all I got for you guys today. If you would like to take some mentoring, as I do some art mentoring for artists, I've got a link down in the description if you'd like to support me. I've got prints, I've got comics, I got a buy me a coffee link down below. Feel free to check out my stuff. Thank you guys for watching. Drop a like, drop a comment, and take care, guys. Thank you.